not to be the classic cliche person that talks about the weather, but boy, this weather has been nice today. And I feel like this weather, I would liken it to a girl that plays really hard to get in terms of the teasing that goes on. And that is what's happening right now. We had a beautiful day today. I'm in a short sleeve tonight, as you can tell. It's a little bit more casual than most nights. The window's open. It's about 60 degrees. Sun was out, driving with the windows down, the whole 9 yards. And the next couple of days will be rainy. So we're in that middle stage where the winter's on its way out, but spring isn't quite here yet. But we'll take it because New England winters, quite frankly, suck. And on that note, welcome back to the Mike the New Haven podcast, ladies and gentlemen. We're not going to be talking about the weather tonight. We will be talking about much more interesting subject matter. But if you haven't checked out the previous two episodes, back-to-back longest interviews in the history of the show, and I'm not saying that sarcastically. It actually is the case. The first one was Tony Johnson, former emergency service unit cop. He worked in Truck 4 in the North Bronx, and that was an interesting show. 3 hours diving into his career from, of course, being a volunteer fireman and EMT to joining the NYPD, the transit police in between, and then the NYPD, then ESU. And then last Friday was former FDNY Special Operations Lieutenant Mike Roy. He also worked in the Bronx in Squad 41, Squad 61, and also worked in Queens and Rescue Force. So he had a full plate, was in FEMA. So two really interesting guys. Tonight's guest is interesting, I should say. And I'd like to shout out Tom Silfone, who put us in touch. Of course, that's why we're talking tonight. And I'll introduce him in a moment. Shout out to Joe Maliga, his better half, Dawn Gonzalez, and everybody watching tonight via YouTube, LinkedIn, and X or Twitter, however you want to call it. A couple of ads. The first thing, and we're making big moves with this, is MC Media Editing Services, LLC. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. Got a new page up. I need to link in the description of this video. I will later. You can go to my Facebook, though. I posted a link to a new Instagram specifically for that LLC, which, if you would be so kind, feel free to give that a follow. Now, I hope you never do need an attorney, but listen, sometimes things happen in life, and if you do, I highly recommend none other than Joseph W. Murray. If you're ever caught on the wrong end of the law, call Joe Murray. Joe's a retired NYPD police officer turned criminal defense attorney. With 15 years of experience in the NYPD from 1987 until 2002, he parlayed a successful career in the NYPD into an equally successful career as a criminal defense attorney. His website is jmurray-law.com, where you can reach him at 646-838-1702, or just email him at joe@jmurray-law.com. Shout out to Joe. Good man. Always a big supporter of mine. Good friend and, good, of course, a big supporter of this show. My next guest may have never served in law enforcement himself, but his numerous partnerships and contributions to the field throughout the years have made him an invaluable asset to it. And what am I talking about? He's been the director of global security for multiple corporations, including some very interesting and scary situations he had to navigate through, as he'll tell me tonight. He was talking about with me off the air. For 23 years, he helped run John Jay College's Counterterrorism program, which has trained a lot of guys and gals who are already in the law enforcement field over the years. And that's been imperative, especially these days in a post 9/11 world. And among his previous stops, not necessarily in this order, but he's worked in these places, as we'll talk about, of course, in private security, is Citibank, Prudential, Dun & Bradstreet, and currently his own consulting firm, Global Security Risk Management. And that is Mr. Paul DeMatteis, who joins me now on the Mike the New Haven podcast. Once again, courtesy of our friend there, your cousin, Tom Silfone. And Paul, it's good to have you. Welcome. How are you?
Yes, thank you for having me. Hopefully, I'll provide your listeners with some interesting information. And I should state off at first, I did try to become a police officer in the mid-'70s when I walked into a precinct, asked for an application. They laughed at me and they said they're laying people off. And that just never happened. And my mom wanted me to be a fireman. So,
there you go. Well, listen, that was during the Ford to City drop dead era, so that was a tough time for everybody. A lot of those guys, they ended up getting laid off. Some of them became bus drivers. A lot of them came back, but that was, time and circumstance, right?
Yep.
Yeah. take a swig of water. It is a warm night out tonight. But, I think one of the reasons I wanted to get you on, we'll dive into your career fully momentarily, is we see what it's like, of course, in the public sector side, getting the law enforcement perspective on what's going on, specifically as it pertains to counterterrorism and preventative crime measures, which a lot of people naturally are curious about. But there's the private sector side too, and that's just as pivotal. And those partnerships are key. So that's one of the reasons I'm glad you're on tonight, because it sheds a light on something that admittedly this podcast has not shed a light on before. So I think your perspective will be very valuable. But before we get to that, you mentioned your childhood, right? You mentioned your mother wanting you to be a fireman. You tried to be a police officer. Where'd you grow up? Where did it all begin for you, Paul?
Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, New York.
Marine Park. Great place to grow up. Really enjoyed my early childhood. Best part is most of the guys I hung out with and girls now live within less than 10 miles of where I'm living now in New Jersey. So we could still play stickball if we wanted to.
Yeah, and that was the era, right, where you had a lot of blue collar neighborhoods, and as a result, a lot of guys and gals that pursued blue collar professions. And there's blocks of kids that grew up in neighborhoods like Brooklyn, Queens, that half the block ended up being cops, half the block ended up being firefighters. So for you, I mean, you kind of touched on it just now. Were those aspirations always there for you, or is it something you really started thinking about as you got older?
No, even before the age of applying for NYPD, I had wanted to do that. I didn't want to do a desk job. I like helping people. I like a little excitement, different day, something different each day. So I really thought that was an opportunity. And I actually worked in Coney Island on the beach for a couple of summers. And they had the NYPD, I think, tactical force down there. And
TPF.
It fortified me wanting to do it. That's all. And, I still got to work with police all over the world. I think I contributed to keep people safe. And I guess the worst thing is I'm the worst businessman you'll ever meet because of my corporate experience and working directly. It's always keep people safe, not make money. So that's something I still can't get rid of.
No, listen, if you're going to wear the moniker that way, that's a good way to wear it, Yeah. Safety over money, because listen, who wants blood money, right?
Yep. And I do too much high risk work where people could actually, have issues. So I would never want that to be on my conscience that I didn't do 150% what needed to be done, no matter what the monetary value at the end of the day is.
Oh, yeah. And thank the Lord for that, so as we'll touch on tonight. And if you have a question for Paul, what I would recommend for those of you in the chat that may tune in via YouTube specifically, because you can't do this on LinkedIn or X, is put it in the super chat on YouTube, whatever amount you would be fond of contributing, and I could highlight it at the appropriate time as we go about our conversation tonight. So as you mentioned, you go during the 70s to try to apply to the NYPD. It's not a good time to really join any police department in the city, neither housing nor transit nor the city, because of how financially bereft the five boroughs is at the time. Now comes the pivot where, okay, this didn't work out. It's a bit of a gut punch, but it's not over. I have to figure out what's plan B. And your plan B turned into something quite interesting, as we'll talk about as we go. So what was the initial plan B after the NYPD didn't quite work out?
Well, I knew I wanted something in the field, private sector or not, work for a large company in more of not even an auditing position, but a control position for a while. And then I realized that wasn't what I was looking for. I did some consulting work on the side. I was very energetic like yourself around your age. And I started a company, and it started very modestly. And I did a lot of different types of projects, mostly system design, but some of my designs were in multi-million-dollar homes, government buildings, some foreign governments. That launched me in that direction. After that, couldn't get a day off, so I figured I think I want to try something different. After about 5 years, sold the company. I went to New York City Human Resource Administration, Office of Data Security Management, long title on a business card. And I was initially responsible for physical security for the welfare system in New York. At 35,000 people at about, 200 locations. And that eventually, I wound up being the director of communication security, and access to mainframes. So I spent about 5 years there, liked what I was doing. Very hard to get things done in a city environment. And then I wound up going to Republic National Bank, and I developed their fraud prevention system, their initial computer security strategies. And then I worked for the owner of the company, who was a billionaire. I worked not for his security in the US, only overseas. So I worked in all his locations, Switzerland, spent a lot of time in the south of France, get no sympathy on that, but I worked very hard. I did the security for his home, which was the most expensive home in Europe, $750 million. So a lot of my work is combined electronics, physical security, and manpower. So we obviously had to have a lot of armed people there too. His family had problems with kidnappings, all sorts of things. And unfortunately, he eventually died at the result of that. It was about 2 years after I left. And I still feel bad because I had told him respectfully that if anything ever happened to him, it's going to be in Monaco. And he died in Monaco. He used to sneak out in a limo with his grandkids. And, he wanted to get rid of all his security temporarily and have a good time like a normal person. So, but anyway, I went from there to Citibank, Prudential, Cravath, Swaine and Moore, Dun & Bradstreet. And all along, I always had my second job at the college since the mid-90s to consulting work. And I also ran for 15 years a karate school for the blind as a nonprofit. So I'm glad I made it through all those years working so hard.
Oh, yeah, you did. We're talking with Paul DeMatteis here on the Mike the New Haven podcast. This is episode 308. If you hear the background noise, because it's warm out, everybody in New Haven is out and about tonight. So forgive that in advance. But the common theme in a lot of these jobs is money. The welfare office, what's at stake primarily? What's the most valuable asset besides the people and their safety? Of course, the money. Public National Bank speaks for itself. The home you were protecting, same thing, $750 million worth was that home at the time.
I think he matched that in artwork.
Yeah, so I mean, you're talking about these go ahead.
No, I just said the artwork and precious items and jewelry was probably about 50% of the value of the house too, so above.
Which is essential ultimately, and attracts a lot of the right people, but also a lot of the wrong people. So going back to that pivotal asset of money, as you know, money can make people go crazy. After all, it's part of the thing that makes the world go round. So kind of like a fighter evaluates his opponent. First, we'll start with the welfare office. As you mentioned, 200 locations throughout the 5 boroughs. You got some people running scams. You got some people that may want to pull off a robbery. Somebody feels like they may have been wronged and they'll go crazy at the office. Different scenarios to keep in mind. But here's a good chance to get yourself on the radar of the right people in the private sector as it pertains to security. We'll start there. What was your initial game plan after studying what the locations were? Maybe the areas in which crime was higher than others, and even who to hire as the right people for security.
They didn't know what their expectations were, but they knew they had a lot of problems. And this is, I guess, mid-'80s. Computers were big and heavy at that particular time. There was a serious concern about really providing adequate service to the client base, which I thought was relatively, it was a great theme. And it really was true, because if systems went down and they couldn't process claims in a welfare office, all hell broke loose. It could be disastrous, people waiting online all day long and then have a disruption because someone's getting upset that they can't get something done or a system is down. So it was really originally about the physical security and then the system security. The systems that they used, they were upgrading at the time, and they were not quite as secure. I mean, at one point, I did a penetration test in 57 Unix-based systems, and I was able to get into 55. One of them actually had completed the instructions we had given them to fortify their security, and the other one was unplugged. So, and they dole out $6 billion a year. So that was a key issue to get under control. The other issue they were having, and they would, at the end of it, was PBX fraud. telephone system fraud, where people would take over your system and allow international calls, and they would hit for a little bit over what was it, $500,000? Yeah, I think it was $500,000 worth of calls. And in my research, I actually found that you could have went into some of the welfare centers back then, and there's client phones in the lobby that you pick up, and it's only supposed to be programmed to go upstairs. But obviously, someone had reprogrammed them, and they were making international calls. And the only way I found out is I try to look at processes and see where there's something unusual in that process. And these phones were always busy when they only should have been, I'm here, okay, come up. So that was one of the major contributions I made to developing policies, procedures, monitoring controls, audit controls for a lot of their systems in that environment.
And mind you, this is at a time in which the internet is newer. So developing tactics to counteract the fraud is not easy because everybody's learning it at the same time. I mean, now forget about it. You know, you got people that's their job. You know, the IT specialists, they can come up with solutions like that before you even finish the sentence and telling them what the problem is. They're already on a diagnosis. In the mid 80s, everyone's kind of scratching their head and saying, huh, okay. And you got people on both sides of the fence, people figuring out, how do we scam this? And then in your case, as you know, we're discussing, people that are trying to figure out, okay, how do we stop the scammers?
Yeah. You know, they didn't even have a network map when I got there. They didn't know what was connected to what or where it was. So that was one of the first things I worked with their systems people to develop that.
Yeah, no,
that helped me going on to Republic National Bank, which was my next stop. And I initially was brought in to do some cybersecurity. It wasn't even called cybersecurity then, information security, in developing basic controls for their systems. And then I moved on to fraud prevention, using actually one of their mainframe programs. Like, once again, I studied the environment. I tried to determine what systems may already be in place. And I developed a system off an existing system that actually ran every night on the mainframe for about a minute and a half, that would look for abnormalities in different systems in there. So how accounts were opened, how transactions occurred, and looking for fraud, basically in the U.S. And then we actually widened that to worldwide. So we could actually see a pattern that in most cases would turn into a fraud. It may not be at this time. It's waiting till the fraud occurs is too late. So this would not even analyze. It was a program that was set to trigger alarms to us if these events occurred out of order or if they occurred. And we saved the bank a lot of money. We had endless amounts of data in our Bank 99, which was the fraudsters' bank. So if you committed fraud somewheres, you wound up in my database. I had one person that just read the paper and put in names. Back then, it could have been Gotti Associates. It could have been anything. International organizations that are, discredited.
Of course, and that's the key. And I'll get to the abnormalities as it pertains to terrorism and finances involving terrorism momentarily, which is a big part of your work. But I like how you brought up Gotti and his associates, because that's the main thing, that we're not that far removed from the era in which the mafia really controlled the city. They drove a lot of the economy in the city through corrupt means, through numerous construction projects, numerous business establishments, some legitimate, some were ran legitimately as fronts, others not so much. And you're picking up on those little things that, who knows, that could have been key into their undoing when federal investigation started down the road.
I worked very close with the FBI on most of the things there, without a doubt.
Tell us about that, if you don't mind, if you can.
I think I said as much as I could say.
No, there you go. Yeah. Put a lot of bad people away. And, again, with most of these things, follow the money. It all starts with the money. There's the murder, there's the mayhem, but there's always a transaction behind that.
Yeah. And occasionally we would catch an undesirable criminal flowing a lot of money through one of our branches. So I'd actually have to tell the branch manager, by the way, Mr. Smith has to go. And they'd ask why, and I'd tell them, they go, oh, I'm scared. They're going to be a gentleman. They were there for a while. They did their stuff. You have to close their account. They won't even ask you why, because they know. And they'll say, okay, thank you, and leave. And they always did. None of them ever had a problem with that. But the frauds that used to go on internationally were amazing, especially because Republic National Bank was a very solvent bank at that time, large gold reserves, very, very secure. So everyone tried to put us in a scheme. So it would be a prime banknote fraud that would say, this is in concurrence with Republic National Bank. People would invest money in it, and in a certain 18 months' time, something would come due, and you'd come to our office in New York on Fifth Avenue, and you would be paid your dividends. And I used to get stuck going into those conference rooms with 20 people and saying, well, we had nothing to do with this. The fraudsters used our name. We had no involvement in any part of it. We're just finding out about it because you just walked in. And then I worked with law enforcement to try to track them down. But in some cases, it would be a payphone in Switzerland in the back of a hotel back in the day.
Yeah, that's where it would start.
A lot of people lost a lot of money on different scams back then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you had a time in which criminals, could have been drug dealers, could have been mob associates, whomever, were walking in with a crap load of cash on them and saying, okay, I want to open an account. And the procedures were such back then, the banks wouldn't even blink an eye. They knew what was going on, but there was really no strict policy in place to say,
oh, no, there was. If you did something, you would have a problem if it was that far out of line. Even if you did you structured deposits in cash, we picked up on, and that was a serious thing for banks to try to control the best it could. Not always. Sometimes things are very hard to detect, but if you're doing a good job, you can keep that down. And all the banks work together on that. Not publicly. Back in the 80s and early 90s, we had monthly meetings with tracking the bad guys that we'd share with each other. I could say now, but back then the attorneys wouldn't have been too happy if we talked about that.
Well, yeah, I can imagine why. It's always a cash trail. Even now, even now with cards and whatnot, it's always a cash trail that you can kind of trace back to the original person. Because I remember hearing stories where I guess some banks didn't have as much success with it as they might have hoped, and some people were able to get off the ground. Maybe not even in America, but in certain lands. But, it's good to know, and I stand corrected on that the laws were stringent, that, people weren't able to get away with it so easily, or even you sucker them in, maybe, tell me if I'm wrong. You give them a false sense of security. Maybe they have the account for a little bit, and boom, you're creating a database on them the entire time that you could eventually partner up with law enforcement on, and you get them.
Well, the bank was very mad at me at one point because I brought out the Republic National Bank used to ship $100 million a day to Russia, to Russian banks. My problem was, how do you become a bank in Russia? Turned out very easily. But all the banks did this. So we had a plane every day, nonstop. We used to distribute. Let me explain that a little bit better so it doesn't sound like a money laundering scheme. We were a currency distributor. So that means like a bank in Brazil, a bank in London needs dollars. They all need dollars. We used to buy it from the Fed in truckloads. And then we had counters, endless amounts of counters and cameras watching them, counting out. So a bank in Kenya would want, it could even be Citibank, wants $200,000 in cash or $1 million in cash. So we would legitimately transact that and then ship it to them with security. When Russia, Russia started to collapse, their banks also had problems. And I think it became easier to become a certified bank. So we were shipping just like to a Citibank. But after further investigations, a lot of these banks were very suspect. And every bank did these originally, and then all the banks started to say, wait a minute, this doesn't look too good. And they did. But there was a lot of security around that, a lot of issues in transport and getting it to the locations that needed to be, delivered to.
given what global politics were at the time with the Soviet Union and other countries that were not exactly on the friends list of the United States, were there procedures in place to not give money to certain banks in certain countries besides what you just talked about with Russia? Were there other lands?
Bankers, bankers are bankers and not politicians. We had lists of what the federal government provided us of countries and organizations we could not work with, and we strictly obeyed that without a doubt on that front. But other than that, it's business. Even back then, I went to the London office. We were having trouble with counterfeits, and it turned out that we had a large amount of $100 counterfeits. I guess vintage '92, maybe. It turned out suspected that Russia had a plot to overthrow our currency by having an exact plate made of our money, which they could do. It's no big deal. And print up money and distribute it as counterfeits if they ever needed to. But after the Russian government collapsed, those plates disappeared. And they were actually someone was printing that money on the same press that we use with Russian plates. I think it was Pakistan, and then shipping the money all over. So I go to London and I'm looking at it and I couldn't tell the difference. And one of the counters there, and that's all these guys do is count, 50 hours a week. Go 1, 1, 1. And he could tell the difference in it. It turned out on the back of the note, it was just, the size of an ant's leg, an extra line. So they would know if they were taking back their own money, believe it or not. Whoever it was, I don't know if it was Russian at that time, but whoever had the plates and was printing them. I actually worked with the Secret Service showing them, I had a medical scanner. Back then, scanners were not that, easy. It's a $5,000 medical scanner that I scanned both a regular bill, counterfeit bill to find the differential in it. And then we had to surrender all the money. And we did one of the Middle Eastern countries when this happened, determined they didn't want any money, any $100 bills. They want all new ones. We had to buy back all their bills and sell them new bills. So very interesting time. But there was always something like that going on there. There was never a dull moment between that. I worked also directly for Edmund on some things because he can't use a bank employee for certain things for tax reasons. So certain projects were directly through him. And sometimes people got kidnapped in South America. Sometimes it was an extra threat at his residence in the south of France, or he had residence in 5 countries. So I could be gone 3 months sometimes. I'd be in South America, then I'd be in France working for him for weeks at a time. It might sound interesting. It is in the beginning, but you miss everything.
But it's amazing, as you pointed out, even with something like the Russian plate scheme, how crafty some people can be. And you really, they often say in the law enforcement world, you got to think 4 or 5 steps ahead at least. You got to be 10, 20 steps ahead with people like this, because it's not just the money. It's all the other, and this is the common theme where you've worked. It's all the other consequences that come with that if they succeed in their plots. If you don't follow the trail, if you don't think of every possible scenario under the sun in which they could manipulate these things to their benefit and the detriment of everyone else, the consequences we'd be here all night if we were talking about how long they would stretch for.
Yeah. No, definitely. But, like you had said, I talked about earlier, is those pre-indicators from counterterrorism. There's indicators before terrorism events. We have to pay attention to them. There's pre-indicators before financial transactions that you could look at. So there's always something. You just have to know where to look. And you might have to look at 10,000 records to find one issue. So it could be a bit on the tedious side.
Yeah, but worth it in the end. You mentioned terrorism. Now we could segue into that. 1993, with the World Trade Center bombing, and I remember from watching this, it's on YouTube, John Miller's interview with Osama bin Laden 5 years later. There's footage of Ramzi Youssef a week before the bombing. at an ATM. So there's a money trail there that they had been building. It kind of started with Meir Kahani's murder in 1990. Money trail there. They were paying for El Sayed Nosir's defense fund, and Osama bin Laden was one of the donors to that. So you see the money gets to Youssef and his gang. Of course, it starts with the deposit on the Ryder truck, which Mohammed Salome stupidly went to go back and get. But here's money that ultimately led to the end goal of an attack that didn't quite cause the intended consequences they wanted to, but an attack nonetheless. It killed 6 people, including Monica Rodriguez Smith and her unborn child. So as far as something like that, there's the whoa. Okay, we know about the Russians. We know about their schemes. We're aware of terrorism. This is not too far after the Gulf War. Now they've finally done it. I'm sure there were procedures already in place, so I won't ask you that, to combat terrorism and, of course, the financing of it. But how did the 93 bombing impact procedures and how they would go about changing them, if at all, after an event like that?
Well, the Trade Center didn't do a lot after that, really, to effectively stop something else. And that's always a problem. Even at Prudential, when we were threatened, how do you balance, business needs with operational security needs? It becomes like you nearly have to close down the business. But there were some lawsuits that not enough was done after that event, that once again couldn't have really prevented anything like the planes hitting the building, but it could have. I guess there was a hope that they'd be able to prevent vehicles from entering more efficiently, and that really didn't happen. A buddy of mine that actually worked for me for a period of time was one of the Secret Service agents that was a bomb tech and actually went down and looked at the hole, and he thought it was maybe a firecracker more could have brought down the building. Now, firecracker is an exaggeration, but it wasn't that far. They nearly accomplished their goals in 93.
Well, of course. It's all in the placement of the truck, as I covered with Detective Johnson for my ESU show last Wednesday, which is, had they parked it a bit closer, and there was a vehicle that was unintentionally obstructing them, not having a clue what was going on, it was just parked there. Had they been able to park a little bit further down, the destruction we saw in 2001 would have been dwarfed by what we saw in 1993. And as Ray Kelly, not on this show, has said multiple times in interviews he's done over the years, it was not the wake-up call it should have been. But nevertheless, there's more terrorism events happening throughout the decade overseas. You get the bombing in 93. You get the bombing of Khobar Towers in 96 in Saudi Arabia. You get the bombing of the embassies in 1998, which killed 200 people. And again, I hate to sound redundant. Money trail, money trail, money trail. How do these attacks happen? Finances. What banks are they using? Could they potentially be using banks as funnels in the U.S.? You don't know until you dig into it. And there comes the aspect of private security and working with law enforcement on this, using the power they have and the connections they have to be able to dig in certain circles and infiltrate them for the best of keeping people safe, as well as what the connections that you've made by this point in the private sector. And that kind of segues into John Jay and that counterterrorism program. Mm-hmm. But before I get into that, tell me about counterterrorism measures you were working with on law enforcement before that program even came to be.
Okay. Well, when I was at Citibank, we had issues that were terrorism related all over. And I had to deal with some of those. And some of it was evaluating the threat. Is the threat realistic? Well, what do we do to compensate it is to minimize any exposures we have? And when I went to Prudential, that's what really led me into really 90% of my work became counterterrorism related, not hunting down terrorists, but making sure that we had the awareness throughout our global operation, 30 countries, to recognize potential problems and to manage them. So that became a focus right after 9/11. Well, actually, we were working on it before 9/11. 9/11 made it a mandate, and that started probably about an 18-month worldwide tour, not only of security assessments and fortification and ways to manage these things, but emergency management protocols. So my team held seminars for all our senior executives and staff, and we had mock drills that we went through. That was actually, one of them was in 4 different languages. We had translators in Japan, so they would be prepared for the speed at which things happen, decisions to make if they didn't see the pre-indicators. So that was a very, very helpful exercise. But then in 2004 is when we had the threat by Al-Hindi that he was going to blow us up. And I had access to a lot of that information, plus Scotland Yard made a lot of it public, which I think annoyed most of the U.S. law enforcement. Some of the videos, some of the transcripts of what he was looking to do. And that really made us develop anti-ramming systems around the buildings, a much higher level of security by far. Because even after 9/11, on 9/12, we had a threat. Car pulls up to our underground parking garage. Person leans out and yells out, "We're blowing you up next." Turns out no one in the U.S., not even law enforcement, had a picture of Al-Hindi, and because the Brits would not release it for years. It was probably him or an associate saying, "We're blowing you up." So that really accelerated a lot of the issues that we were having. I put in, within a short period of time, counter surveillance teams outside the building, very similar to what would be done in an embassy. At the embassy, there are people outside looking at the embassy and people looking at the embassy. So we developed our own private sector team to do that. It was very successful because within the next year and a half, we caught over 50 surveillance teams on us. Now, back then, too, a lot of times people were told, do what you can. If you can go get people nervous by sitting in a black car, reading the Quran outside, do it. So some of them weren't serious. Others were quite serious. People flew in from the Middle East, got off an airplane, came to our building. Al-Hindi's actual report in 2004 was better than a lot of my students as far as English. His thoroughness on identifying weaknesses, very good. He was not an expert in anything, but he supplied enough information to let another team capitalize on his findings. And he also warned them that criminals in Newark are very dangerous, to watch out.
Wow.
So it was, the counter surveillance team helped us put people in. Plus, I had a lot of law enforcement in uniform working for me in the streets and in the buildings. But once, most people don't remember, the summer of 2004, when this became known to the public, it was Sunday, maybe August 4th, something like that. It was the only thing in the news, blowing up Prudential, Citibank, Stock Exchange, World Bank, one other, I forget. So I found out Friday night. I get a call on my way home, get to a landline, and then I was briefed on a high level of what was happening, what they were discovering out of the Middle East. Saturday, I had a briefing with FBI office in Newark. We were made more aware, and the cooperation was phenomenal. I mean, everything had to be very confidential, saying that's a minor statement of the actual events, but they shared all the necessary information we needed to protect ourselves and work with them on a steady basis. So that was good, but we had a day, 2 days to put Jersey barriers up all around our buildings. I have endless pictures. There are many articles on the project and the work. We had, this counter surveillance teams were critical, but we also had Newark PD, state police at different points coming in and out of Newark. You got to remember, 9/11, no one knew what the next thing that was going to happen the next day. In 2004, no one knew what was going to happen the next day. So we had the capability at that time to take out people that posed a threat away from the building. Getting off the turnpike, state police. In Newark police, Newark ESU. So we had a lot of capability and partnerships with law enforcement to really do a phenomenal job. And I think you have room for a funny story that will last around 30 seconds.
Sure, go ahead. Take as much time as you need.
The captain of the ESU unit, the SWAT team captain, great guy, knew him well. Half his men worked for me, in uniform during the day, protective facility. I call him up, and it's Friday night, and I'm telling him what to expect. He thinks I'm drunk. He goes, "Paul, where are you?" He goes, "Listen, I'm telling you because you need to know this. Talk to the mayor. You probably won't find out right away, but you will. Talk to the mayor." The mayor said, "The guy's crazy. Must be drinking somewhere." I'm not really a big drinker. So Sunday, before Ridge goes on air to announce this threat to the U.S., I called him and told him, "You got to get the ESU truck here with a few guys." And they didn't work on Sunday. He was on the beach. So he came in, smelling of suntan lotion, in his turnout gear and helmet, and the truck, and an MP5, and stood in front of the building. And the news media came, and it calmed everything tremendously, because we had more people in work on that Monday showing support for Prudential than expected, which I think was a compliment to what they know, how well the security teams are there. Because I had 25 people plus at least 35 armed officers at any time, and half of the 25 people were armed. So they felt very secure in the environment.
Thanks for sharing that. And that's the thing with terrorism and the long-lasting impact of it. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with money laundering schemes, or schemes, I should say. After the attack itself, what's the first shock value of it, or a method of it? Intimidation through mass murder. Of course, it's the death toll. It's the heartbreaking aspect of that. The much, on a much secondary level, after the death toll, the loss of human life, which is the most catastrophic and the most important thing in something like this, is what it does to the economy. If you can stifle the economy of a country, that's essentially like kneecapping somebody. You take out the balance, they crumple down. Same thing with the economy. If you can essentially, do a Tanya Harding to the American dollar, as these people were looking to do. Again, we talked earlier about long-ranging consequences. You can make an entire nation collapse with something like that.
A few days after 9/11, I met with the head of the FBI in Newark, and me and him sat around figuring out what could be some of the next tragic events that could happen and even make 9/11 look small. I'm not going to mention them, give anyone ideas.
No, don't.
We came up with a number of things, and luckily they never happened, because it's not going to be hard to create real terror across the country, from cornfields to the East and West Coast. And that's sort of scary. I'm scared because the borders are so wide open. And from what the media says, a lot of undesirable people are coming in. And I don't want to sound negative to immigration or people in Central or South America, because I worked endlessly there in Central and South America. People are great. They're nicer than New York. I used to be spoiled. When I came back to New York, I'm used to saying hello to people in the elevator and whatnot. Like they look at like you're crazy. But I worked in Colombia, Brazil, Central America, nicest people in the world. Unfortunately, the bad guys there are very good at their jobs too. But the fear is globally letting in too many people. We don't know who they are. And I have a feeling that the feds know more about what's happening than they're letting on bad guys in the country. But thank God for that.
Yeah, they never really play their hand, which I can understand. They don't have to. But I think, and that's, not to go down a whole rabbit hole on it. It's not like Paul and I are getting political. We don't have a take either way. It's just in general. If you own a nightclub, right? Who do you hire? Bouncers, because you want to know who's coming into your club. What if the person that's coming in's got a warrant? What if they got beef with somebody that's in there and they got a gun on them? You got to know who's in your club, because if it hits the fan, who's that fall back on? You. And if somebody gets hurt or killed, whose blood, is on their hands or on your hands? Well, the blood of that person. So it all comes back to you. Same thing, on a much grander scale with the country. You got to know who's who, because if you don't, it can come back to bite you. It's the same thing, of course, with private security. And I guess now we can get into the John J. Counterterrorism program. I think even before, because Chief Lou Animo is a good friend of mine. He's been on the show multiple times. And he told me in the late 90s, he was talking with John O'Neill, who got killed at the Trade Center. He was the Trade Center's director of security before that, FBI agent in the New York field office. Yeah, and a very smart guy, phenomenal guy. And he knew what was going on in the 90s. And, of course, and what
he
still
laid out
makes me
everything.
angry. And they didn't listen to him.
At his own risk and expense, but that's another story.
Right. Listen, he was a maverick. There's no denying that he was a maverick, and he was a real. I'll use the best expression that I can use, and I've heard this used to describe somebody. Even though he wasn't local police, John O'Neill was the real police, and unfortunately, those above John O'Neill were not the real police, and we'll leave it at that. Otherwise, they would have listened to what he was saying. But with that in mind, Chief Animo was telling me that even before 9/11, in the late 90s, after 1993, he'd sit down with John O'Neill after hours, and they'd be puffing on cigars, throwing back drinks, talking about the terrorism.
Very well known. Yeah. Cigars and some drinks. He built a network of people. Phenomenal. And it was a shame how he wound up leaving the Bureau. Extremely unfair, but another story.
Yeah, in July, August of 2001, all over a briefcase. And they were that's kind of like, how would I liken that? Not to go down a whole rabbit hole on that. You can just say it was petty, honestly, because there was a myriad of things that had happened in the lead up to that. It wasn't that one thing with the briefcase that he forgot, which anybody could have forgotten. It was, the other things they were looking to hang him for, and finally they had a reason, and I use that in air quotes, and they let him walk. But, with that in mind, he was on top of it, and the NYPD after 1993 was on top of it to a degree in the late 90s. Then we get the 11th, and the death toll that comes with that. And that's when Ray Kelly comes in. He builds up the NYPD counterterrorism program from scratch because, as he himself said, and I think he was talking about this with ABC News back in 2004, on September 11th, 2001, he was not doing anything in government. He was pretty much, not retired, but he had done his stuff in the private sector. He had done his stuff in U.S. Customs. He was, kind of just living his life. Comes back to the NYPD and has a hell of a lot of motivation to keep the city safe in the aftermath of something so horrible. And part of that is partnering with the private sector, and part of that is getting the NYPD up to speed on the terrorism threat to the point now where it has a counterterrorism bureau that rivals some federal agencies.
And he brought David Cohen in.
Brought David Cohen, a former CIA guy, on top of that.
I thought that was going to be hard to work with because he's a real maverick. He gets things done on a different level completely. But that worked out well. I mean, phenomenal.
Yeah, very well.
I'm in class at college, and I get someone after class come up to me and say, David wants to talk to you, David Cohen. So I said, okay, is he here? I'd known him before, and I had to go see him in his office. He was on the west side. I don't know if you remember where it first started. You had to go into an art gallery, and that was the address. And called my assistant back in the office and said, is this the right address? Yeah, it's the right address. I'm standing in the art gallery, and I'm looking bewildered, and this woman comes over to me, and she goes, are you looking for the secret elevator? And I said, I guess I am. That wasn't really secret. It was just around in the back. She was an art gallery employee. That was the way in. But he put together such a phenomenal team of people there in a short period of time. Amazing.
And you got to work hand in hand with them as part of the John J. Counterterrorism program, which is still helping to this day. Tell us about your involvement with that and how that started.
Well, oddly enough, sometimes I wasn't actually passing by Jeremy Travis's office, the president, but someone comes up from the Jewish community and says, with all of this going on, do you have someone that knows counterterrorism work? Now, terrorism work might be shooting them, finding them. I protect people from them. Okay, maybe the last resort, unfortunately. So I get called into the office, to Jeremy Travis's office, huge office on the top floor. And I introduced, I don't want to mention too many names, to the person that I worked with for 15 years, doing assessments for all religious organizations to acquire federal funding. So the first year that this happened, when I was brought in, the program had already started. And I had to develop a whole strategy of, okay, how do you protect a building in the middle of Manhattan from a terrorist attack? What do we think that attack may be? What will the tools be that they bring? How will we slow them down? How can we protect the people till NYPD arrives? So that was the first year, just me. But the second year, 2005, they didn't have this program. But 2006, the Fed started this up again. It's still running, the federal terrorism program that supplies hundreds of thousands of dollars to organizations across the country that could prove that there's a threat and there's a logical approach of mitigating that threat, that this money will help. I started a program with my grad students up there to actually go out in the field. Well, they go to 16 hours of additional training, and I mean, very detailed training. And then they would go out in the field, originally with me, to a facility and start doing the assessments. Eventually, that moved on to second year people would go out with first year people. And for, I guess, between 2007 and 14, it was a great program. It gave students that were interested in law enforcement and government work real live experience. They went all across the country. We'd fly them wherever need be. They were phenomenal. Right now, a lot of them are in all different areas of law enforcement. I paid them through the CUNY Research Foundation. It was a real job, real responsibilities. And then when they went to different federal agencies, they used me as a reference, and I would be the contact person at John Jay for the federal law enforcement interviews. So it worked out very well for them. Still keep, oh geez, I don't know how many, probably 300 people went through the program. Wow. And we did about 800 assessments until the school felt it was politically risky, and they canceled the program. So for 1 year, nothing happened. I was with Cravat, Swaine & Moore, a law firm in the city. I was asked to start it up on my own again. I did. And we're at over 1,500 assessments, museums, high-risk schools, high-risk religious institutions, mostly East Coast, but as far as California. So that was still going on now. There is now another organization that's providing some free services. I've trained all their men. They use my materials, so they could actually get this service out to the public for free. But then the back end is the training, endless training, active shooter training. I always find, if you shoot someone on sight, you fail, sort of. You should have seen, there's only one thing, everything that I've seen has had some level of surveillance. You got to identify that level of surveillance. You got to let New York NYPD know. Let them take care of it. Let them go to their house, see all the plans, and arrest them right there. Never getting to you. But if they do get to you, you have to, look like a hard target so no one picks you. Be a hard target. Have the ability to escalate an emergency plan. Have physical security around it in secondary safe haven areas inside. And today, you nearly need, I hate to say this, but it's really independent locations. And if you have the right qualified people, having a qualified armed person on site is very helpful. And the training.
Oh yeah.
Not all law enforcement across the country gets the same level of training. NYPD guys may differ from other locations. If you look at an example, do you remember when they had an art program to draw Muhammad?
That
that
before
was
you
just
continue, let me just provide the context for the audience that may not be familiar before you dive into it. So Muhammad refers to, if you, for those of the Muslim faith, Muhammad the prophet, which is a very, very sacred thing for those of the Muslim faith. And one of the sacred rules, if you will, of Islamic beliefs is you are not supposed to draw or depict him in any fashion. It's considered the ultimate sign of disrespect. And if you recall the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015 in Paris, France, it stemmed from that reason. The terrorists felt that the prophet was disrespected, and so they went to the magazine's quarters and murdered 8 people. So continue.
Yes. Very foolish thing to do.
Yes.
But anyway, they were having this exhibit in Texas, and they had armed people inside, and they had an unarmed security guard outside, and one armed police officer who actually was in traffic, but he was on. Car pulls up, 2 guys get out. I think they had AKs, I'm not sure, semi-automatic. The first one, the police officer shot and killed, and the second one, he shot and killed, while they were pointing automatic weapons at him and firing. Only his training got through that. I mean, that was amazing. He moved quickly. He understood the threat. He had a clear line of fire. He took out 2 people that were going to kill him. If they didn't have him there, I mean, you probably need 10 guys to make up for that guy. They would have got inside. And their defenses were inside. But a tragic event avoided by a phenomenal police officer, really doing great work. And he had to be kept quiet for years because there was a death threat against him.
No, I remember that story. It was referenced, and that's why I was going like this. Not that I was going to cut you off, but I was remembering the story as you were saying it. Bill Bratton actually made reference to it in his latest book, The Profession. He talks about that in reference to when he came back to the NYPD as commissioner in 2014, some of the modifications he wanted to make to Ray Kelly's program. And that was one of them. Understanding the threats and hardening the targets on the outside to where, yeah, there may be defenses on the inside, but if you can prevent them from even getting in, again, all credit to this police officer, phenomenal job, as you said, but it shouldn't take just him. If you can mitigate that crisis by having 10 guys, 15 guys who not only are posted there, but this is what Commissioner Bratton made mention of, and you understand this too, understand the significance of the post and what's around it, what's inside of it, how people can access it. If they know every nook and cranny as well as the terrorists do, you can stop them before they even act.
Yeah. You remember the attack in India?
Yeah, hotel, I believe you're talking about, right?
Yeah, hotel was in multiple locations for multiple days. I was there about right before the pandemic for an executive protection detail I was running there, and I got to go to that hotel. None of the security controls they put in place were functioning or working any longer. And in India, everyone has a different weapon. No one has enough ammo. That was a disaster over there.
It's not going to work. It's not going to work.
No, but for you to then drop down to no security again is very foolish. So.
You're begging for adversaries to come and strike, and we're fortunate. I mean, I'm not in New York City. I'm in Connecticut, but I'm in New York City quite a bit in terms of my business down there and meeting clientele, and of course, seeing my friends and family. And I always breathe a sigh of relief because John Miller used to talk about this. It's not what you see, it's what you don't see. Yeah. I know I can't go a block without seeing an emergency service cop with a long rifle, or a critical response command or strategic response group officers posted with the heavy vest and the tactical gear. And some people may scoff at that and say, why do they have to be there? They're just standing there. What are they even doing? Believe me, when it hits the fan, even to the smallest degree, you're going to be real freaking glad they're there. And I know I am. And I always, walk a little easier and breathe a little easier when I see them.
Yeah. And usually there's other people you don't see at that same time, but I don't want to go into that and give away anything.
No, I know what you mean. You're right.
It's the early warnings and how quick you respond. That's what I get upset. And these balloons have been coming over our country for a number of years, just not recently. I don't even want to say where they're coming from at this point. It's irrelevant.
No, don't say it.
It's just it's a way of testing our response time. We've seen that in terrorism events where they're looking to see how long it takes us to respond. So even something that has no value, that's just flying over and is listening devices or whatever, you don't know if that's a test to see how long it takes you to notice us and then what you do. And, in terrorism related issues on the ground, same thing. If the police are right there, they're probably going to pick a less exposed target, a less hardened target. If the police aren't there, you better look like a hard target, and like it's not going to be successful. This failure is generally not an option in a terrorist attack.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right about that. And, as Bratton and Kelly have pointed out respectively, there have been instances, without going too much into detail, where plots have been foiled because terrorists looked at the potential targets in the city and said, forget it, it's just going to be too freaking hard.
Oh, yeah.
They got us. And that's the ultimate compliment, without them actually explicitly complimenting you, that your operation can get, where they're looking at it and saying, hey, there's nothing we can do here. It's sealed up.
Oh, yeah. Well, when we were done at Prudential, it was sealed up. I mean, it took a lot of money, but it became a very hard target to get through. And that's, like you said, that's what you want. You don't want them to pick someplace else, God forbid, but if they see something that's difficult, they'll look for something easy.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's very well put. This is what I wanted to ask in regards to the counterterrorism program as well. 23 years worth of involvement with it. The threats are changing.
Just to be correct, 23 years maybe from start to finish, but there were some gaps in there too.
Okay. Cumulative, we'll say.
Excuse me?
If you want, cumulatively, 23 years, or as you said, there are gaps in there.
Start to finish between, I taught a program on assessments, cybersecurity, economic espionage, transitioning law enforcement and military into the private sector, the terrorism program too. So there was lots of different ones, but terrorism one was 2004 to about 2014 there. And the other programs were before that and intermixed with it.
I can ask you about some of those momentarily as well, but just focusing on the terrorism program, 2004 to 2014, the threat is the same, but it's changing in this regard. And right at the time you left is when you're starting to see the spark of the lone wolf. You have groups still that are acting. You have ISIS, you still have Al-Qaeda, you still have the Taliban to worry about. But now there are people that may or may not be directly affiliated with the group per se, but they have a fascination with the ideology. They're inspired by the ideology, and they'll try to carry out the attacks to the best of their capabilities, to receive the recognition and praise from these groups, although not being directly affiliated with them. As far as evolving to face the lone wolf threat, without going into too much detail on classified stuff, of course, what would you say to that? And how would you feel do you feel the program evolved to match that?
Well, the threat in the beginning, everyone thought it was going to be a truckload of explosives, which is difficult to acquire, put together. And what you had said earlier, the communications, approval to hit a target was made a blanket approval. Want to hit a target, hit a target. Funding, you get the funding. Because every time funding starts to get involved in it, they get hit. And then communicating, they were getting hit on communicating. And they were doing all sorts of clever things, even including people at different ends of the world having an email account, and they put a draft in, never send it. And then on the other side, they would go to the draft and look at it and receive it. Law enforcement picks up on all of these things, pretty quickly. So that the threat definitely, changed. And when it went to a lone wolf, it was probably, the most concerning part, because it could be anyone. It could be any person that has a mental disability or is in line with the ideology. Even if you look at I think the guy from the Bronx that went up to upstate New York, Rockland County, and he wound up attacking a rabbi with an axe. I mean,
yes,
that's a really hard thing to identify. So it's not impossible. He had to do some surveillance up there. I worked for one of the synagogues up there that has about 3,000 worshipers a day. He went there. He thought that place was going to be as crowded as it was during the week when he did some level of surveillance. He did it on Saturday night where there was no one there. That's why he wound up going to the rabbi's house. But I don't know if you could have picked him up. He just looked like an EDP. He looked like an emotionally disturbed person walking around. But he was doing surveillance. That is still a concern because they can mobilize themselves very inexpensively and perpetrate an attack. They may not even have the highest level of training or efficiency in what they're doing. Yet you have to hope there's some level of surveillance and target assessment that you could identify. Otherwise, you have to be ready for the event. You have to be ready that day. We also always include an escalation plan. I did that when I was at Prudential. You can't wait for senior management's approval to say, okay, you could do this because things are moving too quickly. I developed an escalation plan that actually went to the state and went to New York, and everyone sort of modeled something similar to that, put in what was relevant to them. So here's an exaggeration. I need a helicopter. You can have a helicopter. Whatever it is, I need more armed people. I need the ability to say, don't come to work today. I need the ability to say, go home. That was a critical issue on 9/11 because our senior management team, not used to the guts and blood and all the rest of the theory of what was going on, they were paralyzed. I had to say to them, I think we have to let everyone go home. I think we have to communicate to them. If they have someone they think is in jeopardy, stay here. We'll put them in a hotel. We wanted to get people safe if we could home, but if not, put them up in Newark, let them stay there. So, that escalation plan, that strategy, the actual tabletop exercises to drills to be able to mobilize quickly and make, decisions is critical. But Lone Wolf, I was on Department of State Overseas Advisory Security Council for global risk and for European risk. So we were looking at trends that were happening in Europe because we figured they'd come here. So we thought at that time, a lot of people did, probably all the names of the people you mentioned already, thought it was going to be vehicle attacks. Very simple. We never saw that many vehicle attacks. I still think most U.S. companies really don't have the level of security management in place yet. Matter of fact, a lot of the work I do today is when someone, usually the board of directors, could be some of my project starters or the corporate law department, feels uneasy. They don't know. They think something is wrong. That has been my biggest work lately. Going in when they think something is wrong, and we look at everything from wire transfers to clients to threats to how quickly they respond. How does their technology work? Most of the places that I work with, they don't utilize it correctly. Doesn't work right. They've had 3 different vendors. Nothing talks or works together. And I mean in very high-end billion-dollar companies that there's this problem because things are just done. No one fully understands. They don't have the right policies and procedures in place. And then usually everyone's mad at me because I find too many things.
Nobody likes to be wrong, but hey, that's your job. And better safe than sorry.
Well, they always. We just finished one right before the problems in and around Israel, and I thought they thought it was going to be overkill. But after what happened there, they were thrilled. This was a 3-month assessment that looked at every aspect of their armed people, the weapons they carry, when they get there, their knowledge of the facilities, the electronics, things that they thought were on auto lockdown warrant, things that they thought would. I mean, it was a disaster. So they were very happy. Everyone's happy at the end, but no one wants to see a lot of repairs required and changes.
No, of course. I can understand that from a business standpoint, a reputation standpoint. 2014 to now is another 10-year gap. And so I'll ask you, you're in the private sector now, of course, dealing specifically with your own risk management firm, as I mentioned in the introduction of you. A lot has happened. You mentioned Israel. There's a lot of other things that have gone on in the 10 years since you departed the counterterrorism program in 2014 at John Jay. I will ask you it again without, again, getting into the classified aspect of things. How vulnerable are we now in 2024 as opposed to 2014, as opposed to 2004?
Okay. I think we're more vulnerable. I think we have foreign governments that look at us as possibly weaker than in the past for whatever reasons they choose. The open borders scare me. That we're letting in too many people we don't know. And I've worked all over the world. I've seen some of the gangs and the brutality that they bring. And importing them is probably not a good idea. Not to mention, the nation states people that they're trying to sneak in. If you have something good and that's worth money, people are going to try to take it from the beginning of time. This is not a new deal. So I think we're now at a spot where it's like death by 1,000 cuts. There's so many little things that are going on all around us. If everyone that's our enemy decides to do a couple of things right now, we could be in serious trouble. But remember, I'm paid to be paranoid. So, and I'm sure most of your listeners are also paranoid. I'm paranoid, but yeah, my job is to look at this and come up with a realistic plan to safeguard our assets, our people. And I think we're probably not going to have a good year. That's my opinion.
Hey, listen, it's well-versed given your experiences, and it's personal for me given my, my connections to the NYPD and SDNY and my day job here in Connecticut where I'm working with the West Haven Fire Department. If, God forbid, something happens, my friends, my colleagues are going to be the ones on the front lines. And, much like you saw on 9/11, those were the guys that got killed, that got seriously wounded and got impacted for life, for the rest of their lives by an event like that. So
a lot of
people, too many people, so the more paranoia that's involved with that, the better. If it keeps you up at night, then, hey, first of all, it's a problem. Second of all, let's take the steps to fix it so that we could sleep a little bit better at night, because it's going to boil down to the innocent people working in these locations, and it's going to boil down to the first responders that are going to be responding there to help them if, God forbid, something goes down.
I think it's nearly at a level what you and I can do to solve the problem is becoming more and more difficult. It's not even at local law enforcement. Once again, if we're resulting in a gun battle in the streets of Manhattan and we neutralize the problem, boy, there should be a parade. But we really should have known it before that. Never known about it. No need for a parade. Only a few know what really happened. But it's you just look at every end, and I'm not political. I voted both parties over the years, but one of the things that make me nervous is the level of fentanyl that's coming into the country, disguised as other drugs and lethal doses. It's a weapon of mass destruction, similar to a World War II nuke with the number of people it kill a year. And thank God for the antidote drug, Narcan. Cut down. The number should be 400,000 people. It's under 100,000 because of that drug. And that's only my guess. No real numbers. Whatever. So there will be a breaking point somewhere, and I don't think we look strong globally. It's
no.
I don't know how we could now either. Things just happen, and don't know. I think I saw we're contemplating bringing a Navy SEAL team into Haiti to protect the embassy, from gang-related stuff. That's, and I've worked in Haiti. Haitian people are great. The bad guys are definitely very good at their job.
Unfortunately. And look at now in New York City, you got the National Guard. After 9/11, you saw the National Guard in the New York City subways for understandable reasons. Now you're seeing them, same thing. They're not dealing with the large terrorist threat or in response to a massive terrorist attack as they were in the late fall of, into the winter of 2001. They're dealing with low-level stuff, checking bags, essentially doing the job the NYPD used to be able to do. And it's not the NYPD's fault. There's a lot of reasons, shall we say, as to why things have spun out of control in New York City. not limited to NYPD leadership or lack thereof, and I'll leave it at that as well.
Yeah.
But those that
Well, if you can arrest someone and they get out before you and commit 5 more crimes, there's a problem.
something ain't right.
So,
Something ain't right, Yeah, the cops are doing the job, but those above them aren't exactly helping the cause. And something like that, it's unfortunate. And this is why I'm glad Tom put us in touch. Because again, as I said in the beginning, it's an eye opener. It always seems to take something catastrophic happening, people getting seriously hurt, and people dying for those in these leadership roles who should know better, going, aha, why did it take this for you to say, aha? Why did it take a family grieving, losing their father, sister, whoever, to violence that could have been avoidable if you could have put the measures in place? So I'm glad that there's people like you in the private sector and people like you as well in the public sector and law enforcement that understand this, because if not for that, we've been hit a few times in this country. We've been hit a few times, obviously, in New York City, much like fentanyl. We could have been hit a lot more by now if it wasn't for that counter surveillance, if it wasn't for those counter operations, and if it wasn't for thinking ahead.
Well, David Cohn did a great job with his time here. I was sorry to see him leave.
Yeah.
I know Miller did a great job too, following up on that. But I just don't know. I don't think they're as strong as they used to be, or as funded as well as they should have been or would have been in the past. So, don't know.
That's the tough part. David Cohn, quick story on him before we get to the conclusion of the program. He had a middle name, and because this is a family-friendly show, I can't say what the middle name was in the CIA in the 90s. Whatever birth name or middle name his mother gave him was not his middle name if you knew him in the 90s. It was David effing Cohen in the 90s because, again, he was a maverick. But, hey, he got stuff done. He got stuff done on a clandestine.
A lot of guys from that group, from that era, really phenomenal. David is on top of one of the brightest guys I've ever met. I mean, he has like 3 brains somewhere. I don't know how he manages to store all the data he has, and even the little things. I saw him up at police headquarters on a floor that I was on the wrong floor, and I haven't seen him for like a year or so. He goes, "Hi, Paul. What are you looking for?" It's going. I hardly recognized him. I mean, unbelievable. Very, very brilliant man. We owe him a lot of thanks, and I guess we'll never know why. But he did a lot. And Kelly,
he did. He certainly did. He did a great job from 2002 to 2013 in that role. I tried getting David on the podcast, rather, and unfortunately for me, he declined. I emailed him because he's done some work with Ray Kelly in the private sector, and I understood why he declined. He's a private guy. But I'm like, man, would that have been fun if I would have been able to get him on and pick his brain.
Kelly and all of those guys, and Mitch had me up in their office about 2 years ago. I got a request to go see them. We're talking about a lot of the same things we're talking about here. And the meeting ended, and the fire drill went off. Cohn wasn't there. He was online. Cohn was online. Kelly was there, and Mitch was there, and we're just about ready to leave, and the fire alarm goes off, and he won't leave. He goes, "I'll be the last one to leave the building." And I said, "You mean there's no helicopter coming? Is there a little balcony out there?" And I said, no more helicopters. So we all stayed, walked down with him, and by the time we were on the next to top floor, we let the top floor go down, then we went down. You should have seen the firefighters and cops' faces when they saw him walking down the stairs. It was amazing. With respect, they just they're pushing their way through to do what they have to do. And all of a sudden, they see him, and they all stopped and did the appropriate salute to him being present there. So he's never going to retire. None of them.
No, and that's the kind of respect that he commands. He's one of, if not the greatest police commissioner New York City's ever had. It's not just because he was there a long time. The imprint that he left on the NYPD, some might like him, some might not. Listen, he left the NYPD better than he found it.
Yes. And what I found over the years, that some of the tragedies that we look at now in terrorism, Pittsburgh assault on that synagogue, no doors open. That guy, I had a client there. I was up there right after that. I was there for the local and federal law enforcement briefing. And if someone had seen this guy, I mean, he did donuts around everything because they tracked him after they knew who he was and looking for him. If via his cell phone pings and his license plate on readers. All they had to do is call it in and they would have started this. It never would have happened. And I guess the world changed that day a little bit too. No one expected something like that. But still, I look at places that doors don't lock, or they're not going to stop a bad guy. They're not going to stop that crazy guy with the axe. The only thing that I saw that really was effective, a couple of years ago, there was an attack in Germany. They started at the synagogue, and then he went around and just shot a couple of other people. Thank God for idiots, to be honest. But this was a cemetery with a small synagogue in it, a big gate, and a door. The door was previously unlocked, but because it was a holiday and there was about 100 people inside, they locked the door. Now, I have the video here if you ever want to see it. His camera cam. He was so upset when he got there that the door was locked. Right? He cursed in English, actually. And he had a ton of gear, explosive devices, guns, you name it. He started shooting at the door, couldn't get through. Tried using one of his explosive, incorrectly placed, no matter what type of explosive it was, couldn't blast through the door. 3-4 minutes went by. Everyone knows something is going on. And I'm looking at the video. He could have just pulled his car closer to the wall and just jumped on the hood, roof, and gone in quietly, massacred everyone. So thank God there's stupid bad guys, but they locked the door. Their lives were saved because someone locked the door, and it was strong enough to keep a bad guy out. That's not so hard to do. Sometimes it's those basic things that will keep you safe. And that's what I preach when I go with everyone. Observe everything, report everything. It's not your job to determine if that person is suspicious or not. That's law enforcement's job. And they can figure that out real well and lock the doors. And, make sure it's not a glass door. This had to be some sort of fortified door. And in New York, there's many, many places that have bullet-resistant doors.
There you go. And I think that's a good note to end the show on. Usually we end with the rapid fire, but this was a little bit of a different show because it was more of a discussion on current issues and, of course, your career along the way. But I thank you. And don't sign off yet because I do want to talk to you off the air. But before we go, any last parting shots, any last anecdotes, or any last, points to keep in mind that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I think it's what we talked about. Be observant. Don't become complacent. Even if you're just walking through the city and you see something strange anywhere, be prepared for your family and your work environment if something happens, to protect them and know what to do. In today's world, you have to have faith in your law enforcement departments, which I think we do in New York, even though this static, it's ridiculous. And in your corporate security departments, they have to be effective. It's just the way it is. And bad guys are always going to look to take away things from people that aren't protecting it well enough. It's nothing new. I've been able to work all over the world, 50 countries, 500 assignments. 61 countries, 500 assignments. And there's great people all over. I can't think of any country where I say they're all horrible people because of their religion or anything. I just think in some countries you have some very aggressive criminal elements, and you have some governments that have that same concept of, if you can't protect it, I'm taking it. So, wish I had something. No one invites me to parties because I'm always depressive if you ask me these questions. It's like, no, don't talk to Paul. He's going to say something that's going to upset you.
No, not at all. I'm glad you did. And that's why I wanted to give you the floor to really share the knowledge tonight, because again, private sector, public sector, we need to know this, and it's stuff that we can keep in mind. And these discussions have been had on a lesser scale in my fire department. There's trainings that guys have gone to and spent a lot of time with to keep us prepared. It could be multiple locations. It doesn't have to just be one location. 9/11 was that. World Trade Center, New York City, Pentagon in Washington, D.C. If the heroic passengers of Flight 93 didn't do what they did, would have been the White House and probably in all likelihood in Washington, D.C. as well. So the preparedness is key. It doesn't matter where you are. Civilians could do things even on the small level, like locking the door, as you said. So I'm glad, like I said, that Tom put us in touch, and I want to thank you for your time tonight. Like I said, don't sign off yet. I do want to talk to you
Sure,
off
will
the
do.
air.
Pleasure
Thanks
speaking.
to everyone that. Likewise, pleasure was all mine. Thanks to everybody that tuned in tonight via YouTube, LinkedIn, and of course Twitter or X, whatever you may refer to it these days. And those of you that will listen to this on the audio, remember you can you didn't contribute to Super Chat tonight, that's fine. But for those of you on YouTube, there's always a super thanks as well, which you can contribute down the road. Coming up next on the Mike to New Haven podcast, two interesting shows. One related to news, the other one related, of course, to law enforcement again. She was an anchor for 20 years, and quite a number of those years were spent in New York City on Channel 4. If you watch Channel 4, for those of you from the New York City area, you definitely remember her. That's Carrie Barrett, reporter and anchor for a long time. Now she's a media consultant doing very well for herself in the private sector, taking her journalistic experiences. I'm a fan of Carrie's. I grew up watching her on Channel 4, so it's going to be nice to be able to speak with her. So that'll be this Friday. And he was a New York City transit cop. And that was in the days when the police were the police and transit was arguably the toughest beat in the city. His name's Pete Brazil, and he will be here to tell me about his career, which should be a fun show. That's next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, on behalf of Paul DeMatteis, I am Mike Colón. This has been a very insightful discussion, and we will see you next time. Good night, everybody. Stay safe.